The air in the marble foyer of the Howell estate didn't just smell of expensive floor wax. It was thick with the metallic copper tang of fresh blood and the floor-shaking vibration of a 500-pound predator's growl. Jill Kelly stood frozen, her hands gripped tightly around the handle of her mop. Across the room, two massive white tigers, beasts that looked more like prehistoric spirits than house pets, had backed three armed security guards into a corner. Their eyes glowed with a frenzied, unnatural hunger that no amount of tranquilizers had been able to dull. "Don't even breathe toward that room," the head housekeeper had hissed at Jill during orientation. "The boss's tigers are demons in white fur. 3 trainers are in the ICU this month alone. They are uncontrollable." But as Jill watched the largest male coil its muscles to spring, she didn't see a demon. She saw a familiar, jagged pattern in the way its pupils dilated, a physiological marker from her father's redacted journals. It wasn't predatory aggression, it was a neurochemical overload. John Howell watched from the mahogany balcony above, his face a mask of cold stone. His hand rested on the grip of his holster, his thumb clicking the safety off. He was ready to put down the only things in this world he actually loved. Suddenly Jill's mop clattered to the floor, the sound ringing like a gunshot. Before the guards could fire, Jill stepped into the kill zone, positioning her slender frame in the crisp Black Maid's uniform between the barrels of the guns and the bared fangs of the tigers. Panic surged through her, stripping away her logic. She didn't shout for help. Instead, she reached into the deep recesses of her childhood memories and cried out a rhythmic, guttural command in a forgotten tongue, an order she thought was a plea for them to stop. Zar Karal. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if the tigers had been struck by a physical force. The lead male froze mid-leap, his massive paws skidding on the marble. The frenzied hunger vanished, replaced by a sudden startling lucidity. For the first time in months, the floor-shaking growls ceased. Silence, heavy and absolute, fell over the foyer. Slowly, the two titans dropped to their bellies, purring with a sound like rolling thunder. They crawled forward, not to strike, but to press their massive, heavy heads against Jill's trembling palms in a display of terrifying loyalty. Above them, the safety clicked back on John Howell's pistol. He stared down in stunned disbelief, realizing that the invisible woman he had hired to scrub his floors held the literal kill switch to his greatest weapons. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm responding to everyone. Click subscribe. Like this video. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want me to miss them. Now let's begin. The shadows of the Howell estate were deep, cool, and indifferent, much like the man who owned them. For Jill Kelly, these shadows were a sanctuary. In the world above, the world of bright laboratory lights and prestigious journals, she was a ghost, a disgraced scientist whose name had been scrubbed from every database after she dared to question the ethics of her father's final classified project. Here, in a crisp black uniform with a white lace apron that felt like a shroud, she was simply the girl who polished the silver until it mirrored her own exhaustion. She moved through the vast, silent corridors of the Seoul penthouse with the practiced invisibility of the desperate. Every stroke of her cloth against the mahogany banisters was a payment toward a debt that wasn't hers. Her father, Dr. Silas Kelly, had died with his reputation in tatters and a ledger of gambling debts that the local syndicates had been all too happy to visit upon his only daughter. But the money wasn't the real weight she carried. It was the leather-bound journal hidden beneath her mattress in the servants' quarters, a book filled with DNA sequences that looked less like biology and more like a blueprint for a war. Silas had been a visionary in behavioral genetics, but his last years had been spent in a fever dream of paranoia. He had spoken of the Zar Karal, a phantom lineage of predators engineered to respond to a specific vocal frequency, a biological lock that only one key could open. Jill had tried to blow the whistle on the firm funding him, only to find that the firm owned the board of directors, the local police, and eventually her career. Blacklisted and hounded by collectors, she had fled into the heart of the enemy's territory, taking a job under an alias in the one place no debt collector dared to enter, the home of John Howell. Howell was a man whispered about in the back alleys of Itaewon as a ghost who commanded monsters. To the public, he was a venture capitalist. To the underworld, he was the Iron Tiger, a man who had consolidated the warring factions of the Korean Mafia through sheer calculated brutality. Jill had watched him from the periphery for weeks. He was a creature of sharp suits and sharper silences, a man who seemed to breathe the same pressurized air as the predators he kept in the East Wing. She didn't fear him the way the other maids did. She feared the familiarity she saw in his eyes. He looked like a man who was holding onto his humanity by a fraying thread, much like her father had in those final, frantic months. On this particular evening, the air in the penthouse felt heavy, the barometric pressure dropping as a storm rolled in off the Han River. Jill was assigned to the foyer, a space of cold white marble and towering glass walls that overlooked the neon-lit sprawl of the city. She worked with her head down, her ears tuned to the low, rhythmic pacing coming from behind the reinforced steel doors of the tiger enclosure. The security guards were on edge. She could hear the static of their radios and the nervous click of their boots. They treated the white tigers like malfunctioning machines, but Jill knew better. Through the vents, she had smelled the pheromones of distress. She had heard the specific, high-pitched vocalizations that indicated a nervous system in total collapse. The animals weren't uncontrollable. They were being driven mad by a frequency they couldn't escape. As she knelt to scrub a scuff mark near the enclosure's entrance, she thought of her father's last words to her. "The voice is the blood, Jill. Never forget that the blood remembers." She had dismissed it as the rambling of a dying man. But then the steel doors groaned, and the first roar erupted. A sound so primal, it seemed to shatter the very air in the room. The guards scrambled, their weapons drawn, their faces pale with a terror they couldn't mask. Jill didn't move. She stayed on her knees, her hand resting on the cold marble, feeling the vibration of the predator's approach through the floor. She was a maid in the shadows, a woman who had lost everything to the science of these beasts. And as the white tigers burst into the foyer, their coats gleaming like ghosts against the dark wood, Jill realized she wasn't hiding from the debt collectors anymore. She was exactly where her father's research had always intended her to be. The storm that had been brewing over the Han River finally broke, lashing the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private study with a violent, rhythmic percussion. Inside, the only light came from the dying embers in the hearth and the amber glow of a single crystal decanter. John Howell sat in a high-backed leather chair, the shadows carving deep, weary hollows into his face. He looked less like a kingpin and more like a man drowning in the very silence he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Jill stood by the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The tigers, Ares and Athena, had been moved to a temporary holding area, but their absence felt like a physical weight in the room. The air was still charged with the residue of their earlier frenzy, a ghost of the violence that Jill had somehow averted. "My mother used to say that the white tiger was the guardian of the West, a creature that only appeared when a ruler was just," John said, his voice barely a whisper against the rain. He didn't look at her. He was staring at a faded silver-framed photograph on his desk. She didn't know about genetic labs or behavioral overrides. She only knew the folklore of her village. She believed they were the keepers of the soul. Jill stepped closer, drawn by the sudden raw crack in his armor. "She gave them to you?" "She gave me the first one, a cub, 30 years ago, when the world was a different kind of cruel," John replied. He finally looked up, and for the first time, Jill saw the vulnerability hidden behind the glacial gray of his eyes. "The syndicate took her from me to ensure my cooperation when I was rising through the ranks. They left me with nothing but a set of bloodlines and a legacy of monsters. These two, they are the last iterations of her memory. Every time they roar in pain, every time they lash out because their brains are on fire, it's like watching her die all over again." He stood, walking toward the window to watch the lightning illuminate the city he ruled, but could not call home. "The world thinks I keep them to terrify my enemies. They think the Iron Tiger keeps his namesakes to prove his dominance. But the truth is, I'm just a man trying to keep a ghost alive. And I'm failing." Jill felt a pang of unexpected empathy. She knew what it was to be haunted by a parent's legacy, to carry the weight of a name that felt like a brand. "They aren't ghosts, John. They're living beings trapped in a nightmare they didn't ask for. My father didn't intend for this. He wanted to create protectors, not playthings for men who enjoy suffering." John turned, his gaze intense, searching her face for any sign of the deceit he was so used to. "I've spent millions on the best veterinarians in the world. I've brought in specialists who ended up as stains on the floor. Why you? Why does a disgraced maid with a dead father's secret have the power to make them quiet?" "Because I'm not trying to break them," Jill said softly, moving to the window to stand beside him. She looked out at the rain, seeing the reflection of her own uniform against the backdrop of the sprawling metropolis. "Everyone else sees a weapon. I see the work my father died trying to protect. He loved these creatures. He used to tell me that if you listen to the heart long enough, the mind will eventually follow." John reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. The cold, calculating boss was gone, replaced by a man who was terrified of the very thing that could save him. "If you do this, if you step into my world and fix what they broke, there is no going back to the shadows, Jill. The people I work with, the people I fight, they will see you as the key to the kingdom. You won't be a maid anymore. You'll be a target." "I was already a target, John," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "I've been running since the day they buried my father. At least here I'm fighting for something that can fight back." The corner of John's mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile, or perhaps a grim acknowledgement of a shared fate. He picked up the decanter and poured 2 glasses, handing one to her. "To the monsters," he said, his voice regaining its steel but retaining a new, quiet warmth. "And the women who tamed them." As they drank in the dim light, the distance between the master and the servant began to dissolve, replaced by a fragile, dangerous alliance. The tigers were quiet now, sensing perhaps that for the first time in their engineered lives, the man who owned them and the woman who understood them were finally on the same side. The silence that followed the tigers' submission was more deafening than their roars. It was a thick, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen from the foyer. John Howell descended the grand staircase with the slow, predatory grace of a man who had never seen his will defied, let alone by a woman holding a damp microfiber cloth. The security guards remained frozen, their submachine guns trembling in their hands, looking between the kneeling maid and the 2 500-pound killers who were currently nuzzling her palms like oversized house cats. "Stand up," John commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a gavel. Jill complied, her knees shaking as she pulled her hands away from the soft white fur. The tigers, whom she now recognized as the male, Ares, and the female, Athena, let out low, mournful chuffs at the loss of her touch. She kept her gaze fixed on the marble floor, the lace of her apron fluttering with her shallow breaths. "Look at me," he said, now only a few feet away. Jill lifted her chin. Up close, John Howell was even more imposing. His eyes were a piercing glacial gray that seemed to strip away her alias and her uniform. He didn't look like a man relieved that his pets hadn't slaughtered his staff. He looked like a man who had just discovered a leak in his most secure vault. "What did you say to them?" he asked, his shadow looming over her. I don't know, sir," Jill lied, her voice cracking. "It was just a noise. I was scared." John's hand moved with lightning speed, gripping her chin. It wasn't a violent gesture, but it was absolute. He forced her to turn her head toward the tigers. "They have shredded 3 of the finest trainers from the Serengeti to Siberia. They have ignored high-frequency whistles, tranquilizer darts, and raw meat. And yet, they are currently purring for a girl who smells like lemon polish and cheap soap." He released her, his eyes narrowing. "Do it again. Command them." "Mr. Howell, please, I was just—" "Do it," he hissed, "or I'll give the guards the order to finish what they started, and I won't start with the cats." Jill looked at Eris. The tiger's amber eyes were fixed on her with a terrifying, soulful intelligence. She realized then that the command she had uttered wasn't just a word, it was a sequence. The Zahar Kadal wasn't a language of the tongue, but a language of the blood. If she did this, she was admitting she was more than a maid. She was admitting she was Silas Kelly's daughter. She took a breath, centering herself. She didn't shout this time. She whispered, the vibrations rattling in the back of her throat, hitting that specific, resonant frequency her father had obsessed over. Zahar Kadal, Neo. The tigers didn't just react, they synchronized. They stood in unison, moving to flank Jill, their shoulders brushing against her thighs. They didn't look at John. They looked at the door, their ears pinned back, their bodies forming a living shield around her. They weren't acting like pets. They were acting like guardians programmed to protect a specific biological asset. John's expression shifted from suspicion to a cold, crystalline realization. He stepped forward, reaching out a hand toward Ares's head, but the tiger let out a warning vibration that rattled the glass windows of the penthouse. The beast that had once been John's loyal companion now saw him as a secondary entity. "They aren't just tigers," Jill said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "The stripe patterns, the way their pupils react to the light. They've been augmented. Their limbic systems are hardwired to a vocal imprint." John turned his gaze from the animals to Jill, his eyes dark with a new, dangerous curiosity. "You speak as if you've seen the blueprints." "My father didn't build blueprints, Mr. Howell," Jill whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He built legacies. He called them the Sentinels of the New Dynasty." The air in the room turned frigid. John stepped into her personal space, his scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloping her. He reached out, not to strike, but to trace the line of her jaw with a gloved finger. "Your father was Silas Kelly," John stated. It wasn't a question. The man the biotech world tried to erase. He looked at the tigers, then back at the woman in the maid's uniform. "I bought these animals from a black market lab in Macau. They told me they were the ultimate status symbol. Unbreakable, lethal, and loyal, only to the one who held the leash. But they never told me the leash was a voice." He leaned down, his lips inches from her ear. "You aren't a maid, Jill. You're the missing component of my security detail. And it seems we have a great deal to discuss about the man who made you." The laboratory was hidden behind a false wall in the penthouse library, a sterile sanctuary of gleaming chrome and humming processors that stood in stark contrast to the velvet opulence of the rest of the estate. For the first time in 3 years, Jill felt the familiar hum of a centrifuge beneath her fingertips. She wasn't holding a mop, she was holding a tablet linked to the tiger's biometric implants, scrolling through a cascading river of genomic data that confirmed her darkest fears and her father's brilliance. John Howell stood by the glass observation partition, watching as the two white tigers lay remarkably still on the reinforced exam platforms. They didn't need sedatives when Jill was in the room. Her presence acted like a chemical tether, a biological anchor that kept their hyper-engineered nervous systems from drifting into the red zone of psychosis. "They are dying, aren't they?" John's voice was a low rasp, cutting through the sterile silence. He didn't look like the Iron Tiger in this light. He looked like a man watching his childhood home burn. Jill didn't look up from the screen. "Worse, they're collapsing under the weight of their own design. The fury your trainers saw wasn't aggression, John. It was a feedback loop. Whoever finished my father's work after he passed, they stripped away the regulatory sequences. They wanted weapons that were always on, always ready to kill." She tapped a specific strand of code, highlighting a jagged sequence in pulsing amber. "The command I gave in the foyer, the one I thought was an accident, wasn't just a taming order. It was a failsafe. In my father's original notes, it was called the Sabbath Protocol. It's a hard-coded override, designed to shut down the adrenal surges and force the brain into a state of neuroregeneration." She stepped closer to the glass, her eyes reflecting the scrolling data. The wrong order was actually the only right thing they'd heard in their entire lives. "It's the code for peace. Can you fix them?" John asked. He moved away from the wall, his gaze tracking the rhythmic rise and fall of Ares's massive chest. "The syndicate I bought them from, they want them back. They realized they sold me something they couldn't control, and now they want to use that trigger to turn them against me." "I can do more than fix them," Jill said, her voice gaining a strength she hadn't felt since her career was destroyed. "I can decouple the aggression triggers from their loyalty. I can rewrite the vocal recognition software in their neural links so they respond to empathy, not just commands. But it means they won't be weapons anymore, John. They'll just be tigers. Rare, beautiful, and free of the war you want them to fight." John was silent for a long moment, the neon lights of soul flickering in the distance behind him. He looked at Jill, really looked at her. Not as a maid, not as a tool, but as the architect of a future he hadn't dared to imagine. "I spent my life building an empire of fear because I thought it was the only way to protect what was mine. If you take away their teeth, Jill, you leave us both vulnerable." "No," Jill countered, stepping out from behind the console. She walked right up to the glass, placing her hand against it. On the other side, Athena's ear flicked, and the tigress let out a soft, melodic chuff. "I'm not taking away their teeth. I'm giving them back their minds. A weapon can be turned against you. A companion, that's something no syndicate can hack." For the next several hours, the laboratory became a theater of quiet, precision-engineered transformation. Jill worked with the focus of a woman reclaiming her soul. She adjusted the hormonal baselines, smoothing out the spikes of cortisol that had kept the animals in a state of perpetual torture. She spoke to them in a soft, melodic stream of the forgotten tongue, but she wasn't giving orders anymore. She was narrating their healing. By dawn, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The jagged electric tension that usually radiated from the tigers had dissolved into a deep, resonant calm. Ares stretched, his claws unsheathing and retracting slowly, his eyes clear and focused. He looked at John, and for the first time the boss didn't reach for his gun. He reached for the release lever. As the heavy glass doors slid open, Jill held her breath. The tigers didn't lunge. They padded out with a fluid, natural grace, sniffing the air of the library. Ares approached John, sniffing his hand with a curious, gentle huff, before settling his weight against the man's legs. "They're different," John whispered, his hand finally sinking into the thick white fur. "They're healthy," Jill corrected. "And they're yours, not because you own them, but because they choose to be here." The moment of peace was shattered by the sharp chirp of John's encrypted phone. He looked at the screen, his face hardening back into the mask of the Mafia Boss. "The syndicate has crossed the Han River. They're coming for their property." Jill looked at the tigers, then at John. The wrong order had saved their lives, but now she would have to find the right words to save them all. The transition from the laboratory's sterile quiet to the freezing dampness of a basement in the Guro district was a blur of screeching tires and the acrid scent of a sedative-soaked rag. Jill's world had narrowed to the jagged rhythm of her own breathing and the heavy metallic clink of chains against a rusted radiator. The crisp black uniform she had worn as a shield was torn at the shoulder, a stark reminder that the invisible maid had finally been seen by the wrong eyes. Across the dimly lit room, Park Min-ho, the visionary architect of the rival K-Tech syndicate, sat in a designer chair that looked absurdly out of place amidst the concrete rot. He didn't look like a gangster. He looked like a CEO, cold and meticulously bored. Between them, a holographic display projected the stolen biometric data Jill had been working on just hours before, the jagged amber sequences of the Sabbath protocol. "You have a very rare gift, Dr. Kelly," Park said, his voice a smooth, artificial lilt. "John Howell thinks he owns those animals because he has the money to feed them. But I know better. He owns them because he has you. And now, I have the trigger." He leaned forward, the light of the hologram casting ghoulish shadows across his face. "Give me the vocal sequence. Give me the key to the Sentinels, and I might let you live long enough to see what a real empire looks like." Jill spat a mouthful of copper-tasting blood onto the floor. "The sequence won't work for you. It's not just a word, Park. It's a frequency tuned to a specific genetic marker. My father didn't build a remote control. He built a bond. You can't steal loyalty." Park's smile didn't reach his eyes. He signaled to one of his men, who held up a tablet showing a live feed of the Howell estate. Armed mercenaries were already breaching the perimeter, their thermal optics glowing like demonic eyes in the rain. "I don't need loyalty. I need them to stop biting my men long enough to get them into the transport crates. If you won't give me the code, I'll simply use you as the lure." Even a bioengineered monster knows the scent of its master. Miles away, in the heart of the Howell penthouse, John stood in a room that felt suddenly, agonizingly empty. The silence was no longer the peace Jill had created. It was the silence of a tomb. On his desk, his phone buzzed with a secure video link. He didn't hesitate. Park's face appeared, followed by a fleeting, bruised image of Jill chained in the dark. "She's quite a prize, John. A bit more valuable than a maid, wouldn't you say? I'll make this simple. The deeds to your shipping ports, and the deactivation codes for your Tiger's neural locks in exchange for the girl. You have 30 minutes before I decide she's more useful as a dissection subject." John's hand tightened on the edge of the mahogany desk until the wood groaned. For a man who had spent decades calculating the value of every life in his service, the math should have been easy. The shipping ports were the arterial veins of his empire. Losing them meant his downfall. Giving up the Tiger's codes meant handing over the most advanced biological weapons on the planet. "John, don't." Jill's voice drifted through the speaker, faint but steady. "Don't give him what he wants. He'll kill us both anyway." "Quiet, Dr. Kelly," Park hissed. John looked at the two white tigers sitting at the edge of the room. They weren't pacing anymore. They were watching him, their amber eyes reflecting a strange, mournful intelligence. They knew she was gone. The iron tiger felt something crack inside his chest, a sensation more painful than any bullet wound he had ever sustained. He realized then that he didn't care about the ports. He didn't even care about the tigers as symbols of his mother's memory. He cared about the woman who had looked into his soul and told him he wasn't a monster. "The ports are yours," John said, his voice a low, terrifying growl that made even the tigers stir. "I'm sending the encryption keys now, but hear me, Park. If there's a single new bruise on her when I arrive, I won't just kill you. I will let the tigers show you why they were called the Guardians of the West." He cut the connection and turned to Eris and Athena. He didn't reach for a leash. He didn't reach for a gun. He reached for the heavy steel door of the freight elevator. "She's waiting," he whispered. The tigers didn't need a command. They moved as one, a blur of white fur and lethal intent, following the man who was finally willing to burn his empire to the ground to save the heart that had tamed him. The basement air was thick, with the smell of wet concrete and the ozone of the K-Tech security drones humming overhead. Jill Kelly didn't wait for a rescue. She knew the rhythm of the facility now. The way the vibration of the heavy machinery upstairs masked the sounds of the dark. Her hands, though bound by zip ties to the radiator, were steady. She wasn't a maid anymore. She was a predator's architect, and she knew the one truth Park Min-ho had overlooked. The tigers weren't just in the Howell estate. They were linked to her. She closed her eyes, focusing on the subvocal hum she had embedded into the tiger's neural links during the reprogramming. It was a biological tether, a psychic bridge built on her father's research. She didn't need to scream. She began to hum, a low, oscillating frequency that vibrated through her teeth and into the marrow of her bones. It was the Zarkaral homing beacon. Outside, the compound erupted. The sound wasn't the rhythmic fire of John Howell's mercenaries. It was a symphony of splintering steel and the primal bone-chilling roar of Ares and Athena. They hadn't come for the rival boss. They had come for the frequency. As the basement door was kicked open by a panicked guard, Jill didn't shrink away. She used the radiator as a fulcrum, swinging her legs around to sweep the man off his feet. Before he could level his pulse rifle, a blur of white fur and 500 pounds of muscle crashed through the high, narrow window of the basement. Athena landed with the silent grace of a falling shadow, her amber eyes locking onto Jill. "The ties, Athena." "Neokai," Jill commanded, her voice a calm blade in the chaos. The tigress didn't bite. She used a single, precision-sharpened claw to snag the plastic binding, snapping it with a flick of her head. Jill scrambled up, her circulation returning in a painful rush. She grabbed the guard's dropped keycard and the pulse rifle, checking the charge with a practiced thumb. "Stay low," Jill whispered to the tigress. "We're not leaving the way they expect." She didn't run for the front gates where John's men were trading fire with the syndicate. Instead, she led Athena through the ventilation sublevels, using the tiger's superior senses to navigate the maze of steam pipes and electrical conduits. When they encountered a secondary security team in the server room, Jill didn't hide. She gave Athena the right order, a silent hand signal that sent the tigress into a flanking maneuver, while Jill provided suppressing fire, her aim true and cold. They emerged into the rain-slicked courtyard, just as Park Min-ho's private chopper began to lift. Jill stood her ground, the white tiger at her side, a living testament to a power that couldn't be bought. She didn't need a master. She had the monsters, and for the first time, they were truly hers. The storm that had followed them back from the Guro district finally unleashed its full fury, drowning the Seoul skyline in a gray deluge. Inside the Howl estate, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The Iron Tiger had returned to his throne, but the throne was now a command center, and the king was taking orders from his maid. Jill stood at the center of the library, her torn uniform replaced by a tactical vest, her fingers flying across a holographic map of the estate's perimeters. They weren't just coming for revenge. Park Min-ho was coming to reclaim his perceived property, and he had brought the full weight of the K-Tech Syndicate's heavy ordnance. The sensors on the outer walls began to scream. A fleet of armored transport drones and black-clad mercenaries were breaching the Han River gates, using high-frequency jammers to cut the estate off from the outside world. "They're through the first line," John said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He checked the magazine on his custom sidearm, his eyes flicking to the two white titans pacing behind Jill. "Jill, if we don't let them off the leash, they're going to tear through my men. We can't hold 100 soldiers with mercy." Jill looked at Eris and Athena. Their muscles were coiled like overwound springs, their tails twitching with the primal urge to hunt. The Syndicate's jammers were broadcasting a distorted version of the old Fury frequency, trying to trigger the tigers into a blind, murderous rage that would make them easy to trap. "If we let them kill, Park wins," Jill said, her voice steady despite the explosions rocking the floor beneath her boots. "He wants to prove they are monsters, so he can justify their weaponization. I won't let my father's legacy end in a bloodbath." She stepped toward the tigers, placing a hand on each of their massive heads. She could feel the heat radiating from their skin, the vibration of a hunger that had been suppressed for too long. She closed her eyes, tapping into the neural link she had spent the last 48 hours perfecting. She didn't use the Zarkaral command for peace, nor the one for war. She reached for the sequence she had titled, "The Sentinel's Vow." "Listen to me," she whispered, the frequency humming through the bone conduction mic at her throat. "Protect the home. Defend the life. But do not take the soul. Zarkaral, Shura." The right order flooded the tiger's nervous systems like cool water. The frenzied glint in their eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, tactical focus. They didn't roar. They didn't lunge. They moved toward the balcony doors with a synchronized, ghostly silence that was far more terrifying than any outburst. As the Syndicate mercenaries breached the library windows, shattering the glass in a rain of crystalline shards, they expected to meet a hail of bullets or a pair of rabid beasts. Instead, they met a force of nature. Ares didn't go for throats. He moved like a blur of white lightning, using his massive weight to shoulder-check soldiers into walls, his paws swatting weapons from hands with enough force to break bone but not to kill. Athena operated in the shadows, her movements a masterclass in psychological warfare. She appeared from the darkness, pinning men to the floor with a terrifying growl that vibrated through their chests, holding them in place with the mere threat of her weight until John's security team could zip-tie them. It was a beautiful, violent ballet. The mercenaries, trained for traditional warfare, were paralyzed by the tiger's restraint. How do you fight a predator that isn't trying to eat you, but is systematically dismantling your ability to fight back? In the center of the chaos, Jill and John stood back to back. John fired precision shots at the drones overhead, while Jill monitored the tiger's vitals, adjusting their sensory inputs in real time to keep them from being overwhelmed by the flashbangs and sonic grenades. "They're retreating," one of John's captains shouted over the comms. Park's elite guard, seeing their comrades neutralized without a single fatality, felt the primal terror of the unknown. They weren't fighting animals. They were fighting an intelligence they didn't understand. The remaining Syndicate forces broke ranks, fleeing back toward the rain-slicked gardens, only to find the exits blocked by the two white guardians, standing perfectly still like statues of living marble. As the final mercenary dropped his weapon in surrender, the silence returned to the Howell estate, broken only by the sound of the rain and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the tigers. John turned to Jill, his face splattered with soot, but his eyes bright with a new kind of respect. He looked at the tigers, then back at the woman who had rewritten the rules of his world. "You did it," he whispered. "You protected the home without becoming the monster." Jill let out a breath she felt she had been holding since she first picked up a mop in this house. She looked at Ares and Athena, who were now padding back toward her, their heads low, seeking the touch of the only person who had ever seen them as something more than a weapon. "We did it," she corrected softly. "But the war isn't over until the man who started it is gone." The perimeter of the Howell estate had become a graveyard of high-tech ambition. Smoke from downed drones mingled with the heavy soul fog, creating a ghostly landscape where the only sound was the hiss of the rain on hot metal. But the silence was a lie. Park Min-ho, driven by the desperation of a man who had lost his leverage and his legacy in a single night, had bypassed the main assault. He appeared from the shadows of the West Colonnade, not with an army, but with a single high-caliber sniper rifle and the frantic eyes of a cornered rat. John Howell stood in the center of the courtyard, his silhouette framed by the flickering lights of the damaged foyer. He was surveying the surrender of the last mercenary group, his back momentarily turned to the darkened gallery. Jill saw the glint of the barrel first, a tiny, lethal spark of moonlight reflecting off glass. "John!" The scream had barely left her throat when she lunged. She didn't think about the physics of the bullet or the fragility of her own skin. She only knew that the man who had traded his empire for her life was standing in the path of a ghost. She collided with him, her weight throwing him toward the marble fountain, just as the crack of the rifle shattered the night air. The world slowed to a crawl. Jill felt a searing white-hot iron brand her shoulder, the force of the graze spinning her onto the wet stones. The pain was a secondary realization. The primary one was the sound that followed. It wasn't a roar. It was a vibration that seemed to tear the very fabric of the atmosphere. Ares and Athena had been standing down, honoring the right order of restraint. But the moment Jill's blood hit the marble, the fail-safes Jill had programmed were overridden by something far deeper than code. It was the primal protective instinct that her father had never been able to suppress, the ancient bond between the guardian and the heart of the lineage. The tigers didn't wait for a command. They became a singular, terrifying force of nature. Ares cleared 30 feet in a single, terrifying leap, his white form a blur of lethal grace. Park didn't even have time to chamber a second round before the tiger was upon him. There was no mauling, no messy display of gore, only the absolute crushing weight of a predator who had found its mark. Ares pinned Park to the stone wall, his massive jaws snapping shut inches from the man's throat, the hot breath of the beast fogging Park's expensive glasses. Athena was a shadow at Jill's side, her massive body shielding her creator from any further threat. The tigress let out a low, sustained growl that rattled Jill's teeth, her eyes fixed on the remaining shadows of the gallery, daring another shooter to emerge. John was on his knees beside Jill in an instant, his hands shaking as he pressed a silk handkerchief to the red bloom spreading across her tactical vest. His face, usually a mask of iron, was fractured with a raw, agonizing fear. "You're a fool," he hissed, though his voice broke. "You were supposed to be the one who stayed safe." Jill managed a weak, pained smile, her hand reaching up to touch his face. "I told you, I don't need a savior, John. I need a partner." Across the courtyard, the threat was over. Park Min-ho, the man who wanted to weaponize the soul, was weeping in the grip of the very creature he had tried to claim. He had seen the face of a god, and it was white fur and amber eyes. John looked from Jill to his tigers, seeing for the first time that the bond wasn't about control or commands. It was about sacrifice. He looked at the blood on his hands, Jill's blood, and he knew the Iron Tiger was dead. The man who remained was something else entirely. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, as the tigers stood watch over the ruins of an empire that was finally ready to be reborn. 6 months later, the air over the Howell estate no longer carried the heavy, metallic scent of tension or the ozone of security drones. Instead, it smelled of pine, damp earth, and the clean, salt-kissed breeze blowing off the Han River. The high-tech reinforcements that had once made the penthouse a fortress had been stripped away, replaced by expansive, open-air habitats and reinforced glass walkways that allowed the world to look in, not at a criminal's lair, but at a miracle of conservation. The Howell Global Wildlife Foundation was now etched in discreet brushed steel at the entrance of the valley. It had been a tectonic shift that sent shockwaves through the soul underworld. John Howell had dismantled his empire with the same cold precision he had used to build it, liquidating assets, turning states' evidence against the K-Tech syndicate, and funneling his vast fortune into a trust that ensured no genetically altered animal would ever be used as a weapon again. Jill stood on the observation deck, her silhouette sharp against the rising sun. The tactical vest and the maid's uniform were long gone, replaced by a simple lab coat over a dark sweater. The scar on her shoulder still twinged when the weather turned, a permanent map of the night she had chosen to stop running. Behind her, the rhythmic tapping of a keyboard echoed through the new research hub. She wasn't scrubbing floors, she was heading a team of geneticists, tasked with reversing the damage done to predators across the globe, using her father's research as a foundation for healing rather than harm. Below the deck, in a valley that had been reclaimed from industrial rot, Ares and Athena moved through the tall grass. They weren't pacing the marble halls of a prison anymore. They were stalking the shadows of a forest designed just for them. Their movements were fluid and natural, the Sabbath protocol now a permanent part of their baseline. They were no longer sentinels. They were simply tigers, beautiful and terrifying in their own right, free from the vocal chains of any master. A heavy step sounded on the wooden slats of the deck. John approached, his gait more relaxed than she had ever seen it. He had traded his razor-sharp suits for a rugged jacket, his hair slightly silvered at the temples from the stress of the transition. He stopped beside her, his hand finding hers on the railing. The Iron Tiger was a name the newspapers used for the history books. To the world now, he was the man who had turned a den of thieves into a sanctuary for the lost. The board approved the expansion into the Mongolian preserve this morning, John said, his voice no longer a low growl, but a steady, resonant baritone. They want you to lead the field team for the first release. Jill looked at him, her eyes bright with the thrill of the work. And what about the CEO? Can he handle the paperwork without his lead scientist around? John let out a short, genuine laugh, a sound that still felt like a victory every time she heard it. The CEO is thinking about coming with you. I've spent enough time in glass towers. I'd rather see the work in the dirt. He turned to her, his expression softening into something deep and unwavering. There was no master and servant here, no boss and employee. They were two people who had been forged in the same fire and come out the other side as something stronger. You saved me, Jill. Not just from Park, but from the person I was becoming. We saved each other, she corrected, leaning her head against his shoulder. Below them, as if sensing the shift in the air, Ares let out a long, resonant roar that echoed through the valley. It wasn't a cry of fury or a demand for submission. It was a declaration of presence. The white tiger looked up toward the deck, his amber eyes catching the morning light, before turning back to follow Athena into the deep green of the sanctuary. The legacy of Silas Kelly was no longer a secret buried in a blood-stained journal. It was alive, breathing, and free. And as the sun climbed higher over the mountains, Jill and John stood together, watching their new world take shape, a world where the predators and their protectors finally shared the same peace. Thanks for watching. Please like, comments, and subscribe.